Gildan Media presents Your Coach in a Box, affordable, life-changing audio programs. Gildan Media presents an unabridged recording of Abraham Lincoln, A Life, Volume 2, by Michael Burlingame, narrated by Pratt. From Springfield to Washington, Inauguration, and Distributing Patronage, February 1861 to April 1861. Chapter 19. The man does not live who is more devoted to peace than I am, but it may be necessary to put the foot down firmly. From Springfield to Washington, February 11th through 22nd, 1861. The ever-obliging Lincoln agreed to undertake a taxing, circuitous, 1,900-mile train journey from Springfield to Washington in order to accommodate Republican friends in various states where they wanted him to speak. There were obvious drawbacks. The trip would be tiring. He would be exposed to potential assassins. And such a journey would not suit Lincoln's taste for simplicity and aversion to any form of pomp. Moreover, though he would have to speak often, he could say little, for he wished to postpone until the inauguration any mention of his policy regarding the swiftly evolving secession crisis. Because the journey would be indirect, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Pittsburgh, then a detour through Cleveland, Buffalo, Albany, New York, Trenton, Philadelphia, and Harrisburg, it would consume 12 days. To demonstrate his indifference to assassination threats, Lincoln would have preferred a more direct route than the roundabout one finally selected. John W. Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, said that Lincoln abandoned the idea of coming to Washington via Wheeling, Virginia, in consequence of certain alleged threats of violence from parties in Virginia and Maryland. These considerations did not deter Lincoln, for he believed that official invitations from state legislatures could not be ignored. John Hay, perhaps reflecting Lincoln's thoughts, offered another reason for his decision. The progress of the president-elect cannot but be fortunate in its influence upon the tone of public feeling in the Union. The devotion which men in general feel for their government is a rather vague and shadowy emotion. This will be intensified and will receive form and coloring by personal interviews of the people themselves with their constitutional head. The trip would also divert attention from the secession crisis, and might enhance Lincoln's legitimacy if huge crowds turned out to welcome him. "It is important to allow full scope to the enthusiasm of the people just now," Salmon P. Chase told Lincoln upon learning of his proposed itinerary. Other concerns doubtless influenced Lincoln as he pondered whether to take a long, slow journey to the nation's capital. In selecting a cabinet, he told Thurlow Weed he had been much embarrassed by his want of acquaintance with the prominent men of the day. The train trip would allow him to consult with Republican leaders outside Illinois about patronage and policy matters. Moreover, he might inspire the people he addressed in Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York with the same kind of confidence that he had generated among juries and voters in the Prairie State. Lincoln understood that those who elected him were eager to see what he looked like, and he was willing to satisfy their curiosity. Originally, Lincoln had intended to have his wife and younger sons join him in New York for only the final leg of the trip. He evidently wanted to spare them the fatigue of the longer journey. On February 9th, he changed plans because General Scott advised that his wife's absence from the train might be regarded as proceeding from an apprehension of danger to the president. This must have pleased Mary Lincoln, who was eager to accompany her husband. At the last minute, however, the plan was again altered, for reasons that are not entirely clear, and Mrs. Lincoln was not aboard when the train left Springfield. She joined it at Indianapolis the next day. En route from the Illinois capital to the U.S. capital, Lincoln ended months of public silence with a flurry of speeches, foreshadowing his eagerly awaited inaugural address. But as his train zigged and zagged its way eastward over the tracks of 24 different railroads, his rhetoric seemed to zig and zag between confrontation and conciliation. Was he a hawk or a dove? Some days he seemed to be the former, other days the latter. The trip begins. The train consisted of 3 ordinary coaches and a baggage car. Lincoln occupied the rear car. The entourage included his eldest son, Robert, and his 2 secretaries, John G. Nicolay and John Hay, as well as journalists, political allies, and friends. For protection, a military escort was arranged, but to avoid a bellicose appearance, some of its members joined the party later. Among those guarding the president-elect were Army officers who volunteered for that duty while on leave, including Colonel Edwin V. Sumner, Captain John Pope, Captain William B. Hazen, Major David Hunter, and Captain George Whitfield Hazard. Assisting them were James M. Burgess, whom the governor of Wisconsin detailed to Springfield as a bodyguard, Thomas Mather, Adjutant General of Illinois, Ward Hill Layman, Lincoln's burly colleague at the bar and close personal friend, and Elmer E. Ellsworth, a young militia leader who had achieved national renown and was a surrogate son to Lincoln. The president-elect denied the necessity for such an escort, insisting that there was no danger whatsoever. He wanted to avoid appearing as though he traveled under guard. In charge of travel arrangements was William S. Wood, a one-time jeweler and hotel manager, who came to Springfield in January 1861 at the suggestion of Seward, Weed, and their friend Erastus Corning, a railroad manager, prominent New York Democrat, and relative of Wood. Seward claimed that Wood had had vast experience with railroads, had organized long excursions, and knew many railroad officials. Wood was handsome, self-important, and condescending. On the trip he paid close attention to the whims and caprices of Mrs. Lincoln. She could be difficult on trains. Returning from a shopping trip to New York earlier that winter, she used free passes on each leg of the journey. In Buffalo, she found herself without a pass for one stretch, and indignantly protested when she was asked to pay. Her son Robert appealed to the superintendent of that company. "The old woman is in the cars raising hell about her passes. I wish you would go and attend to her." As the train rolled eastward on the morning of February 11th, Lincoln took a pencil and on a large pad wrote out a speech that he was to deliver in Indianapolis later that day. As he filled the sheets, his secretaries took them and made copies. John Hay reported that something of the gloom of parting with neighbors and friends, bidding farewell to the community in the midst of which he has lived for a quarter of a century, seemed to affect him. He was abstracted, sad, thoughtful, and spent much of his time in the private car appropriated to his use. Lifting his spirits briefly were large crowds cheering him vociferously as the train passed through hamlets like Cerro Gordo, Sodorus, and Iresdale. At Decatur, thousands had gathered to pay him honor. When he descended from the train, they insisted on shaking his hand, embracing him, and showering him with blessings. At the second stop, in Tolono, the crowd badgered him into giving a speech, which amounted to little more than a polite acknowledgment of their warm welcome. Their response was as intensely wild as if he had read them his inaugural address. The brakemen on the train found it soul-stirring to see these white-whiskered old fellows, many of whom had known Lincoln in his humbler days, join in the cheering. And so it went for the next 12 days. As Nicolay recalled, "It is hard for anyone who has not had the chance of personal observation to realize the mingled excitement and apprehension, elation and fatigue which Mr. Lincoln and his suite underwent, almost without intermission, for the period of nearly 2 weeks during this memorable trip." Hay recollected that there was something of religious fervor in the welcome everywhere extended to him, and the thronging crowds that came out under the harsh skies to bid him Godspeed. Repeatedly, Lincoln ascribed such enthusiasm to the office he would soon occupy, and to the nation he would lead, rather than to himself personally. If the crowds were impressed, Henry Villard was not. Lincoln always had an embarrassed air on such occasions, and he resembled a country clodhopper appearing in fashionable society, and was nearly always stiff and unhappy in his offhand remarks, Villard wrote. At each stop, enthusiastic committees greeted Lincoln on behalf of legislatures, governors, wide-awakes, working men's clubs, and many other organizations, each one anxious to shake hands, deliver speeches, extend invitations, and exchange stories. Lincoln's friends, concerned for his safety and comfort, grew alarmed when he submitted himself to the mercy of these well-meaning but often inept committeemen. The resulting confusion was dangerous, as Nicolay remembered. Amid the push and crush of these dense throngs of people, and this rushing of trains, clanging of bells, booming of guns, shouting and huzzas of individuals and crowds, it was difficult to instantly determine which call was the more important or more proper, and a false start might not only bring on an irretrievable waste of time and a derangement of official programs and processions, but a false step might even bring danger to life or limb, under wheels of locomotives or carriages. The impatient committees would occasionally tumble pell-mell into a car and almost drag Mr. Lincoln out before the train had even stopped, and habitually, after stoppage, before the proper police or military guards could be stationed about a depot or stopping place to secure necessary space and order for a comfortable open path to the waiting carriages. For a while Mr. Lincoln could not resist the popular importunings, for his sympathy with and for the people made him shrink, not as a matter of reasoning, but apparently upon some constitutional impulse, from any objection to or protest against the over-eagerness and over-officiousness of these first greetings. Only after some days of experience and several incidents of discomfort did he conquer that impulse, but having mastered it, he kept it for the remainder of the journey under perfect control, and would remain seated in his car until he received the notice agreed upon that preparations outside had been deliberately completed. Mary Lincoln also found the committees a trial. Halfway through the trip, Captain Hazard, part of the military escort, reported that Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln are worried almost out of their lives by visitors of both sexes. Every village sends a reception committee of 20 or 30, and some of them bring their wives, so that not only are all the seats in the cars taken, but the passway is filled with people standing. Neither the president nor his wife have one moment's respite, and they are evidently tired of it. The Lincolns enjoyed little privacy outside their sleeping area, for people came and went at will. At Lafayette, Indiana, Lincoln offended some listeners with his impromptu remark that, "We are bound together, I trust, in Christianity, civilization, and patriotism." Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss of Cincinnati took umbrage. "We do not believe there is a German infidel, American eccentric, spiritual rapper, or atheist in the northern states who did not vote for Mr. Lincoln. Let us see how much benefit he will derive from their Christianity." Hardline speech in Indianapolis. That evening at Indianapolis, where a 34-gun salute and thousands of vehemently hurrahing Hoosiers greeted him, Lincoln pleased stiff-backed opponents of appeasement with a startling preview of his inaugural address. He began his remarks, delivered from the balcony of the Bates House to an audience of 20,000, by analyzing the words coercion and invasion. Would the marching of an army into South Carolina, for instance, without the consent of her people, and in hostility against them, be coercion or invasion? He asked. Although he did not mention it, Lincoln may well have been thinking of George Washington's dispatch of 12,000 troops to crush the Pennsylvania Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Yes, he conceded, it would be invasion, and it would be coercion too, if the people of that country were forced to submit. At the same time, if the federal government simply insists upon holding its own forts, or retaking those forts which belong to it, or the enforcement of the laws of the United States and the collection of duties upon foreign importations, or even the withdrawal of the mails from those portions of the country where the mails themselves are habitually violated, would any or all of these things be coercion? Do the lovers of the Union contend that they will resist coercion or invasion of any state, understanding that any or all of these would be coercing or invading a state? If they do, then it occurs to me that the means for the preservation of the Union they so greatly love, in their own estimation, is of a very thin and airy character. If they became ill, they would consider the little pills of the homeopathist as already too large for them to swallow. They regarded the union not like a regular marriage at all, but only as a sort of free love arrangement, to be maintained on what that sect calls passional attraction. A Southern paper sarcastically queried, "Is not this a chaste and elevated comparison? Is it not on a level with the dignity of the subject?" In later years, Lincoln might have likened secession to a no-fault divorce. Lincoln then asked, "By what principle of original right is it that 1/50th or 1/90th of a great nation, by calling themselves a state, have the right to break up and ruin that nation as a matter of original principle?" Now, I ask the question, I am not deciding anything, with the request that you will think somewhat upon that subject and decide for yourselves, if you choose, when you get ready. Where is the mysterious original right from principle for a certain district of country with inhabitants, by merely being called a state, to play tyrant over all its own citizens and deny the authority of everything greater than itself? I say I am deciding nothing, but simply giving something for you to reflect upon. This hardline speech, though couched in mild terms, thrilled the crowd, which shouted, "That's the talk!" and "We've got a president now!" John Hay reported that Lincoln's delivery was as impressive as the substance of his remarks. His voice was clear and sonorous, and his colloquial style singularly effective. There was, Hay said, something inspiring in the individual presence of the man. His manners are simple, almost to naivete. He has always a friendly, sometimes a jocose word for those who approach him, but beneath all this the resolute, determined character of the man is apparent. The Northern press carried Lincoln's address, which Congress and the public regarded as a sign that he would resist secession. According to Henry Villard, the speech was of the greatest significance, although it deals more in intimations than in definite assertions. In Cincinnati, the speech created an immense sensation, for it was looked upon as a decided coercion pronunciamento and a declaration of war against the South. William L. Hodge, a Louisianan who would be appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury months later, reported that Lincoln's foolish, uncalled for, and unfortunate Indianapolis speech was doing vast mischief in Washington, where the President-elect's best friends deprecated it. It was, Hodge claimed, having a very unfortunate effect on the peace conference and Unionists in Virginia. Southern senators and congressmen, indignant at the Indianapolis speech, threatened to block all legislation, including the means to pay the government's expenses. Many of their constituents inferred that Lincoln would dispatch troops to enforce the law. Southern newspapers criticized the reckless boldness of the speech, which breathed of war and amounted to sporting with fireballs in a powder magazine. The New Orleans Crescent belittled Lincoln's use of rhetorical questions. Mr. Lincoln betrays an utter inability to rise to the dignity of his subject. He resorts to the indirect and unsatisfactory and undignified expedient of asking questions of the populace before him, instead of coming out like a man and saying flatly what he means. Too timid to express boldly his sentiments, he resorts to the roundabout way of putting interrogatories, thereby suggesting what he would not declare openly, and then, for fear of its being considered too great a committal, reminding the people that they must recollect he was only asking questions, not expressing opinions. Northern papers, in contrast, defended Lincoln's position as the only one that duty permitted. Other ground than this the President-elect could not take, if he would regard his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, unless he were to regard it as in fact the rope of sand which another construction has seemed to make it, observed the Boston Daily Advertiser. The New York Tribune hailed Lincoln's speech as a welcome indication of his resolve to insist that, if concessions were to be offered, the South had to make them. Should Lincoln's implied insistence on collecting the revenues and retaking federal facilities lead to war, so be it, declared the New York Evening Post. If war comes, it must be made by the South, but let the South understand, when it does come, that 80 years of enterprise, of accumulation, and of progress in all the arts of warfare have not been lost upon the North. The New York Herald, however, condemned the speech for exhibiting the obstinacy of an intractable partisan, and proclaiming a line of policy adverse to union and to peace, and eminently adapted not only to enlarge, strengthen, and consolidate the new Southern Republic, but to destroy the hopes of law and order of the North in a wasting civil war. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper worried that some passages were capable of a terrible misconstruction. Seward's friends, surprised by the belligerent tone of the Indianapolis address, sent a telegram asking if it were genuine. Thurlow Weed left Washington immediately after reading Lincoln's remarks, and Cassius M. Clay warned that Lincoln will have to modify his Indiana speech so as to hold on to the status quo. A blow struck to regain lost forts will unite the South. Lincoln had evidently intended to give this speech to the Indiana legislature on the following day, but that event was canceled. The fatigue caused by a reception the night before may have been responsible for the change in plans. There, the President-elect's coolness, under the terrific infliction of several thousand handshakings, prompted Hay to remark that he unites to the courage of Andrew Jackson the insensibility to physical suffering which is usually assigned to bronze statues. The young assistant secretary judged that the rack, the thumbscrew, King James's boot, the cap of silence, with all the other dark and recondite paraphernalia of torture, become instruments of cheerful and enlivening pastime, beside the ferocious grip and the demonic wrench of the muscular citizen of the West. Lincoln's prankish son Robert made matters worse by standing outside the hotel and guiding dozens of mischievous lads to shake the hand of his unsuspecting father. Because the ordeal almost prostrated Lincoln, his advisers resolved to keep future receptions short. Things did not go smoothly at the Indiana Capitol. Like many other committees in charge of arrangements, Indianapolitans proved imperfect. Outsiders appropriated the carriages designed for the presidential party, compelling most of the entourage, clutching their luggage, struggling through the crowds to the Bates House. Hay found that the hotel's halls, passages, and rooms have been congested with turbulent congregations of men, all of whom had too many elbows, too much curiosity, and a perfectly gushing desire to shake hands with somebody, the president, if possible. If not, somebody who had shaken hands with him. Chaos reigned in the dining room, where Lincoln had to sit 20 minutes before being served. Waiters mishandled orders, spilled sugar down patrons' backs, and brought biscuits to those ordering ham, and pickles to those requesting tea. The mayhem amused Lincoln. The president-elect was emphatically not amused when his son misplaced a carpet-bag containing the only copies of his inaugural address. Robert, not yet 18 years old, had accepted an invitation by fellow adolescents to see the city's sights, and carelessly left the precious bag with a hotel desk clerk. When asked about the location of the valise, Robert replied to his father in a tone of bored and injured virtue. A look of stupefaction came over Lincoln's face as he heard what the lad had done, and visions of that inaugural in all the next morning's newspapers floated through his imagination, according to Nicolay. Without a word, he opened the door of his room, forced his way through the crowded corridor down to the office, where, with a single stride of his long legs, he swung himself across the clerk's counter, behind which a small mountain of carpet-bags of all colors had accumulated. With a little key, the president-elect began opening all the black bags, much to the surprised amusement of onlookers. Eventually, he discovered his own carpet-bag, which he took charge of thereafter. Ward Hill layman testified that he had never seen Mr. Lincoln so much annoyed, so much perplexed, and for the time so angry. He added that Lincoln seldom manifested a spirit of anger toward his children. This was the nearest approach to it I had ever witnessed. Conciliatory speeches in Cincinnati. The next morning, Mrs. Lincoln arrived in Indianapolis a few moments before the presidential train departed for Cincinnati. En route to the Queen City, she impressed one observer unfavorably. As a gentleman with a newspaper passed by her, she asked, "Is that a Cincinnati paper you have in your hand?" When assured that it was, she queried, "Does it say anything about us?" Taken aback by her self-importance, he was reminded of an honest Dutchman who had unexpectedly been elevated to the position of major of the militia. When the result of the election was known, his children wanted to know if they would now all be majors. "No, you fools," indignantly replied the mother. "None but your daddy and me." Lincoln's gloom lifted this day, the 52nd anniversary of his birth. "He has shaken off the despondency which was noticed during the first day's journey," John Hay informed readers of the New York World. As the president-elect prepared to leave Indianapolis, some Illinois friends bade him farewell and returned home. Among them were Jesse K. Du Bois and Ebenezer Peck, who embraced him vigorously, clipped a lock of his hair as a souvenir, and urged him to behave himself like a good boy in the White House. Illinois Democrats satirically recommended that the hair be preserved as a state treasure. As the train sped along at 30 miles per hour, huge crowds at each station greeted the president-elect with wild cheering. At one stop, Lincoln indulged his well-wishers with some brief remarks in which he took his customary modesty to extreme lengths. "You call upon me for a speech," he told the residents of Lawrenceburg, Indiana. "I have been selected to fill an important office for a brief period, and am now, in your eyes, vested with an influence which will soon pass away. But should my administration prove to be a very wicked one, or what is more probable, a very foolish one, if you, the people, are but true to yourselves and to the Constitution, there is but little harm I can do, thank God." Approaching Cincinnati in mid-afternoon, the train was forced to halt by a crowd so large that it spilled onto the tracks. Police had to clear the way into the depot. As Lincoln proceeded to his hotel, a ride in an open carriage lasting 2.5 hours, he was hailed by more than 50,000 people lining the streets. A future president, Rutherford B. Hayes, reported that there was a lack of comfort in the arrangements, but the simplicity, the homely character of all was in keeping with the nobility of this typical American. Another witness described a source of that discomfort. Lincoln was standing erect with uncovered head, and steadying himself by holding on to a board fastened to the front part of the vehicle. A more uncomfortable ride than this, over the bouldered streets of Cincinnati, cannot well be imagined. Perhaps a journey over the broken roads of eastern Russia, in a tarantass, a low-slung horse-drawn carriage informally known as a liver-massaging device, would secure to the traveler as great a degree of discomfort. Mr. Lincoln bore it with characteristic patience. Hay noticed that all windows were thronged, every balcony glittered with bright colors and fluttered with handkerchiefs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?